Let's travel back in time for a moment. Now I'm going to tell you a story, quietly, calmly. Just listen. Imagine this. High in the mountains of medieval Persia stands an impregnable fortress. From its stone walls emerge people capable of bypassing any guard, assuming any appearance, and disappearing like a shadow. Their very name strikes terror into the hearts of sultans and kings from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean. Today, I will tell you the story of the most enigmatic organization of the Middle Ages, the Sect of the Assassins. People who turned murder into an art and death into a weapon. This is not just the story of a medieval sect. It is a tale of how ideas can be stronger than armies, how fear becomes a weapon, and how the legacy of a long-vanished organization still influences our world. Make yourselves comfortable. We are embarking on a journey 8 centuries long to the origins of fear as a weapon, to the mountains where the legend of the assassins was born, the end of the 11th century. The world is not at all as we know it now. The Islamic East is torn by religious disputes, and in the mountains of Persia, something truly special is brewing. This was a time when the fate of entire nations depended on the will of one man, when the word of a caliph or sultan could start a war or bring peace. You know, sometimes I think about how one person can change the entire course of history. There once lived in ancient Persia an educated man named Hassan-i Sabbah. He was born in the city of Qom, a sacred place for Shia Muslims, where the air is literally saturated with religious debates and philosophical reflections. Intelligent and well-read, he deeply studied Islamic theology from his youth, but his soul was drawn not to traditional religion, but to something more mysterious. In those times, the Islamic world was experiencing a serious crisis. The great Abbasid Caliphate, which had once stretched from Spain to India, was falling apart. Independent emirates and sultanates were emerging everywhere, each with its own ambitions and claims. The Seljuk Turks had conquered most of Persia and Asia Minor, but their power was also fragile. And most importantly, Muslims could not agree among themselves on who had the right to lead the Islamic community. The Sunnis recognized the caliphs of the Abbasid dynasty, while the Shias believed that power should belong to the descendants of Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. And among the Shias themselves, there was no unity. Some followed the 12th Imam, others the 7th. Hassan-i Sabbah joined the Ismailis, that branch of Shia Islam that recognized the 7th Imam, Ismail. The Ismailis believed in a hidden Imam, a spiritual leader who lives among people but reveals himself only to the chosen. When the time comes, he will appear to the world and establish justice on earth. This idea deeply captivated the young Hassan. But for now, there was little justice. The Ismailis were persecuted by the Sunni rulers. They were considered heretics. They were hunted. Their books were burned. Hassan saw injustice around him, wars between fellow believers, and his heart filled with anger. In his youth, he even served at the court of the Seljuk Sultan, holding a rather high position there. But gradually he realized the system could not be changed from within. The interests of those who hold power are too strong, injustice is too deeply rooted. And then Hassan made a decision that forever changed his destiny and created one of the most mysterious organizations in human history. He decided to create his own state, where the laws of the true faith would rule, where there would be no place for tyranny and arbitrariness. But what can one man do against powerful sultans and their armies? Hassan understood. He could not win in open battle. His supporters were too few, and money was even scarcer. A different path was needed. A fortress was needed that no army could take, and such a place was found. High in the Alborz Mountains, north of modern Tehran, at an altitude of over 2,000 meters above sea level, stood the ancient fortress of Alamut. The local people called it the Eagle's Nest, and this name perfectly conveyed its essence. Imagine this scene. On a sheer cliff that rises straight from a mountain valley like a giant wall, a fortress stands tall. The path to it is so narrow and winding that only one person can pass at a time. And all around, endless mountains, snow-capped peaks, deep gorges where the wind howls and the echo repeats every sound. The fortress was built back in the 9th century by local rulers of the Justinid dynasty. They chose this place for a reason. From here, they could control important trade routes leading from the Caspian Sea into the heart of Persia. But over time, the fortress lost its significance, its owners became impoverished, and the garrison dwindled. In the year 1090, Hassan-i Sabbah appeared at the walls of Alamut. How exactly he captured the fortress, different stories are told about this. According to one version, he bribed the commandant. According to another, his supporters secretly infiltrated and opened the gates. There is also a quite romantic legend that Hassan won the fortress by betting its owner that he could buy as much land as an ox hide could cover, and then cut the hide into thin strips and encircled the entire fortress with them. But however it happened, Alamut became his. And from that moment, an amazing story began. The first thing Hassan did was to fortify his new home. The fortress was quite large, but many of its parts needed repair. The walls had to be strengthened, the towers completed, the storerooms filled with provisions and weapons, and, most importantly, a water supply system had to be created that would allow them to withstand a long siege. Alamut had a source of fresh water. This was one of its main advantages. But Hassan understood. The water had to be enough not only for the garrison, but also for the civilian population that would seek refuge behind the fortress walls in case of danger. Gradually, like-minded people began to gather around Hassan. Ismailis came, fleeing persecution in other lands. Simply disgruntled people came, people who were tired of living under the rule of cruel rulers. Adventurers came, attracted by the romance of fighting against superior forces. But Hassan did not accept everyone. He carefully selected people, tested their loyalty, studied their character. He needed not just warriors, he needed fanatics, ready to die for an idea. And many such people were found. The Ismaili doctrine had a special appeal for those seeking the meaning of life. Ismailis believed that the world is imperfect, but it can be changed, that there is a hidden truth, accessible only to the initiated, that every person can become a participant in a great cause, the building of a just society. Hassan created a unique system of education and training in Alamut. Newcomers were not immediately initiated into all the secrets. First, they had to prove their loyalty, pass various tests, and show that they were ready to obey any order. The training was comprehensive. Future assassins studied not only warfare, but also languages, history, geography, and the basics of medicine. They had to be able to pretend to be anyone, a merchant, a scholar, a soldier, a pilgrim. They were taught to memorize faces, eavesdrop on conversations, and find weak spots in people's characters. Special attention was paid to physical training. Assassins had to be strong, agile, and resilient. They trained to climb sheer cliffs, move silently in the dark, shoot accurately with a bow, and master various types of bladed weapons. But the most important thing was spiritual education. Hassan understood. For a person to be ready to sacrifice his life, he must believe in the sanctity of his cause. He must be convinced that death in the name of the true faith is not the end, but the beginning of a true life. A special atmosphere reigned in the fortress. There was no room for idleness or entertainment here. Every day began with prayer, continued with study and training, and ended with contemplation of higher matters. People lived modestly. content with simple food and clothing, but their eyes burned with an inner fire. Gradually, rumors about the mysterious old man of the mountain, as Hassan's enemies came to call him, spread throughout the Islamic world. It was said that a man with supernatural abilities lived in the impregnable Alamut, that his servants were ready to carry out any of his orders, even if it cost them their lives. And where did the word assassin itself come from? Hassan's enemies called his people hashishiya, that is, users of hashish. They claimed that only under the influence of drugs could a person be made to go to certain death. From this came the European word assassin, which came to mean a hired killer. But is this true? Modern historians are doubtful. Most likely, the accusations of drug use were just propaganda designed to explain the inexplicable, the fanatical devotion of Hassan's followers. After all, if you admit that people go to their deaths for their beliefs, you have to admit the power of their ideas. And the ideas were indeed powerful. Hassan preached not just a religious dogma, but a whole philosophy of life. He said that the existing order was unjust, that rulers thought only of their own gain, that the common people suffered from their tyranny, and that all this could be changed, not by mass uprisings, which would only bring new suffering, but by precise strikes at the very roots of evil. Thus was born an idea that shook the medieval world, the targeted elimination of tyrants and their henchmen. Not mass murders, not the slaughter of the innocent, but the surgically precise removal of those who hinder the establishment of justice. In those times, this was a truly revolutionary idea. Before that, wars were fought by large armies, cities were captured, and entire provinces were devastated. But Hassan proposed another way, to remove one person and change the fate of an entire state. For in the medieval world, power was indeed concentrated in the hands of individuals. The first fidais, those who sacrificed themselves, were ready by the end of the 11th century. These were young men who had passed through the harsh school of Alamut, men with burning eyes and calm faces. They did not fear death. On the contrary, they saw it as liberation from an imperfect world and a transition to the true world. And so the moment came when Hassan decided to show the world what his new organization was capable of. The first victim was Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Sultan, one of the most influential men of his time. This man was not just an official. He effectively ruled a vast empire, patronized the sciences and arts, and founded schools and libraries. Many considered him a wise and just ruler. But for Hassan, he was an enemy, a staunch opponent of the Ismailis who persecuted his fellow believers. And in the year 1092, something happened that changed the entire course of medieval history. A man dressed as a Sufi, a Muslim mystic, approached the vizier, who was riding in a litter. No one suspected anything. Sufis often begged for alms from noblemen. But instead of an outstretched hand, the stranger drew a dagger and delivered a fatal blow. What struck all the witnesses? The killer did not even try to escape. He stood calmly next to the body of his victim, awaiting his inevitable execution. There was neither fear nor regret on his face, only a strange serenity, as if he had fulfilled a sacred duty. This case became a model for all subsequent actions of the assassins. They were not hired killers in the usual sense of the word. They were fanatics, going to their deaths for the sake of an idea. Rumors of this assassination spread through the Islamic world faster than locusts. People whispered incredible things to each other. A new power had appeared, one that could reach anyone, even the most powerful ruler. And this power lived somewhere high in the mountains, in an impregnable fortress from which there was no road back. Fear, that became the new weapon of Hassan-i Sabbah. Fear, perhaps even more effective than his daggers. For when a ruler fears every stranger, every servant, every shadow, he is already half defeated. Alamut became a symbol that even the most powerful tyrants are not safe from retribution. That justice can come from where it is least expected, that a small group of determined people can change the course of history. Thus, in the mountains of ancient Persia, a sect was born that, for a century and a half, would hold half of the then-known world in fear. A sect whose methods would become a model for centuries to come. The sect of the assassins, the children of Alamut, servants of the hidden imam, warriors of justice, as they called themselves, and their enemies called them simply killers. You know, there are titles in history that sound like incantations. The Old Man of the Mountain. That's what the leaders of the assassins were called by their enemies and even their allies. In these words, one can hear something ancient, wise, and at the same time, frightening. When you say these words, an image of a gray-bearded sage comes to mind, sitting in a stone tower high in the mountains and deciding the fates of kings and sultans. Let's transport ourselves to those distant times when a completely unique system of governance was being formed in the impregnable Alamut. The 11th century was an era when the personality of the ruler meant everything. But even against the backdrop of that era, what Hassan-i Sabbah created looked completely unusual. In those days, the world was simpler and harsher at the same time. There were no modern means of communication, no developed bureaucracy. Power rested on personal authority, on the fear and respect that the ruler inspired, and Hassan understood this perfectly. Imagine a strict pyramid of power built on principles that would astonish even modern management specialists. At the very top, the Grand Master, the very old man of the mountain, whose will was absolute law for everyone else. But this was not tyranny in the usual sense. It was power based on the deepest respect and religious veneration. Hassan-i Sabbah understood. For people to obey without question, they must see him not just as a commander, but as a spiritual mentor, an almost holy man. He rarely appeared in public, and even more rarely left the walls of Alamut. This mystery only enhanced his authority. People told each other legends about his wisdom, his ability to see the future, his connection with higher powers. Below the Grand Master were the da'is, preachers and teachers. These were highly educated men who had undergone a long path of spiritual development. They not only recruited new members for the sect, but also governed the individual fortresses that the assassins gradually captured or built throughout Persia. The da'is were the true intellectuals of their time. They knew not only Ismaili theology, but also philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Many of them wrote treatises that were read far beyond the Ismaili communities. They were skilled in debating with the most educated people of their era and often won these debates. Even lower were the rafiqs, companions, who formed the backbone of the organization. These were people who had already completed their initial training, were devoted to the sect's ideas, but had not yet reached the highest levels of initiation. They handled economic affairs, guarded the fortresses, and gathered information. And finally, the most mysterious and frightening group, the fida'is, those who sacrifice themselves. They were the very assassins in the sense we use the word today. Ready to give their lives to carry out any order from the old man of the mountain, they represented something completely unique for their time. And now, are you ready to hear the most famous legend about the assassins? The one that the great traveler Marco Polo told his astonished listeners in Venice, and that still excites the imagination of people all over the world. It was said that Hassan created an artificial paradise in Alamut, a place of such indescribable beauty that those who saw it lost their minds with admiration. Young men selected for training in the art of killing were given a special potion to drink, perhaps from poppies, perhaps from other plants, known for their intoxicating effects. When a youth fell into a deep sleep, he was carried to this secret garden, hidden behind the high walls of the fortress. Imagine this picture. A young man wakes up in a place of indescribable beauty. Exotic flowers bloom around him, exuding intoxicating aromas. Clear streams murmur, in which golden fish splash. Gentle music, played by unseen musicians, sounds in the air. Beautiful maidens in silk robes, as if brought to life from Persian miniatures, bring him exquisite dishes, honey in golden cups, fruits he has never seen, drinks that make his head spin with just one sip. It seems that time has stopped in this corner of bliss, that there is no room for sorrow and pain here. The maidens tell the youth about the wonders of this place, sing songs of eternal love, and treat him to every imaginable pleasure. And he, stunned by the happiness that has suddenly befallen him, cannot understand. Is this a dream or reality? After a few days? Or was it weeks? Time flows differently in paradise. The youth was again given the same potion and, in an unconscious state, returned to the ordinary world. When he came to his senses, he saw harsh stone walls around him, heard the howling of the mountain wind, felt the chill of the highlands. And then the old man of the mountain himself appeared before him, majestic, wise, surrounded by an aura of mystery. Hassan would speak to the youth in a low voice that penetrated to the very soul. "You have seen the paradise that awaits you after death. You have tasted its fruits. You have known its joys. But there is only one way to get there, by unconditionally carrying out my will. I am the gate to paradise. I am the path to eternal bliss." A beautiful legend, isn't it? A story that takes your breath away and explains the incredible devotion of the Fides. But modern historians view this story with great skepticism. They believe it was propaganda from the assassin's enemies, who could not understand and explain their self-sacrifice in any other way than through the effects of drugs. How else, thought the sect's enemies, can you make a rational person go to certain death? Of course, only by drugging him. It was easier for them to believe in a fairy tale about a magical garden than to admit the power of the ideas that Hassan preached. In reality, the system of training the Fides was much more complex and subtle than any narcotic potions. It was based on the deepest psychological influence, a gradual change of consciousness, the creation of a special world view in which death for the sake of an idea became the highest good. Hassan and his followers were not just religious fanatics, they were true masters of the human soul. They studied people's characters, their weaknesses and strengths, their secret desires and fears. And they knew how to use all this to achieve their goals. The selection of candidates for the Fides began very early. Hassan preferred youths from religious families, those who were accustomed to strict discipline and deep faith from childhood. But personal qualities were no less important. Courage, determination, the ability to keep secrets, and a readiness for self-sacrifice. The training of future assassins lasted for years and included many different disciplines. First of all, of course, was the study of the fundamentals of Ismaili doctrine. The youths were introduced to secret books, the hidden meaning of the Quran was explained to them, and they were told about the coming of the hidden Imam who would establish a kingdom of justice on earth. But religious education was only part of the program. Future Fides were taught languages, Arabic, Persian, Turkic, and sometimes even Greek and Latin. After all, they would have to operate in different countries, among people of different nationalities. They were acquainted with the history, geography, and customs of various peoples. An assassin had to be able to pretend to be anyone: an Arab merchant, a Persian scholar, a Turkic warrior, a Christian pilgrim. To do this, one needed to know thousands of small details: how people of different classes dress, what their habits are, what they talk about, how they behave in various situations. Special attention was paid to the study of human psychology. Assassins were taught to read people like an open book, to determine by facial expression what a person is thinking, to guess their intentions by gestures and intonations, to find weak spots in their character and use them. Physical training was no less important. Fidais had to be strong, agile, and resilient. They were taught to climb sheer cliffs, move silently in the dark, and cover long distances on foot. They trained in swimming, horse riding, and handling various types of transport. Mastery of weapons was a given, but the assassins preferred not swords and spears, but concealed, inconspicuous weapons. Their main tool was the dagger, short, sharp, which could be hidden in the folds of clothing. They studied human anatomy, learning to deliver precise blows from which the victim would die instantly and almost silently. No less important was the art of handling poisons. The assassins were the greatest experts on toxic substances of their time. They studied plants and minerals, animal toxins, and knew which poisons acted quickly and which slowly, how to disguise poison in food or drink, and how to make death look natural. Their arsenal included dozens of different poisons, from those that killed instantly to those that took effect weeks after ingestion. Some caused symptoms similar to common illnesses, while others led to madness. It was a true science of death, brought to perfection. But the most important part of the training was spiritual education. Hassan understood. For a person to be ready to sacrifice his life, he must deeply believe in the sanctity of his cause. He must be convinced that his death has a higher meaning, that it opens the way to eternal life in paradise. The Fidais spent long hours in prayer and meditation. They were taught to see symbols and signs in the world around them, to seek hidden meaning in everyday things. Gradually, their consciousness changed. They began to perceive earthly life as a temporary trial, and death in the name of faith as liberation and a reward. This process resembled what we today call brainwashing. But in those times, such methods of influencing the psyche were the norm for any religious upbringing. The only difference was that the assassins took these methods to the extreme. A fully trained Fidai was a unique combination of a fanatic and a professional. On the one hand, he was ready to die for his faith without the slightest hesitation. On the other, he possessed all the skills necessary to carry out the most complex missions. Such a person could live for years next to his future victim, gaining their trust, becoming a friend or a servant. He could study their habits, daily routine, and entourage. And when the order came from the old man of the mountain, the Fidai acted quickly, precisely, and ruthlessly. What is most astonishing is that they almost never tried to escape after completing a mission. Having delivered the fatal blow, the assassin would calmly await his inevitable execution at the hands of the victim's guards. He felt neither fear nor regret, only a deep satisfaction from a duty fulfilled. This readiness for self-sacrifice made an incredible impression on the people of the Middle Ages. In those days, most warriors fought for booty, glory, or by compulsion. Mercenaries could switch to the side of whoever paid more. Even religious fanatics usually hoped to survive in battle. But here were men who went to their deaths solely for an idea, and death was not a possibility, but an inevitability. The world had never seen anything like it. The assassins' methods differed radically from all the accepted ways of warfare at the time. Traditional armies fought on the battlefield, besieged fortresses, and plundered captured cities. The goal was simple: to defeat the enemy by force, seize his territories, and force him to submit. The assassins operated completely differently. They did not seek to conquer large territories or amass immense wealth. Their goal was to exert targeted influence on the political situation through the elimination of key figures. It was a kind of political surgery, precise, swift, and effective. One successful assassination could change the balance of power in an entire region, stop a war, or, conversely, start one, bring the right person to power, or remove a dangerous opponent. Behind this apparent simplicity lay years of painstaking preparation, careful planning, and information gathering. Before deciding to assassinate a particular ruler, the political situation was studied for a long time in Alamut, and all the pros and cons were weighed. Hassan-i Sabbah was not just a religious leader. He was an outstanding strategist who could see far ahead. Every action of his people was part of a grand plan aimed at creating the conditions for the triumph of Ismaili ideas. Thus, in the mountains of Alamut, a philosophy was born that would define the development of secret warfare for centuries. A philosophy according to which one man with a knife can be stronger than an entire army if he knows where to strike and is willing to pay for it with his life. Bloody deeds and political games. And now, let's talk about what transformed the assassins from a religious sect into a formidable force capable of influencing the fates of nations. About those deeds that made thrones tremble and forever changed people's ideas about what a small group of determined fanatics can do. We have already talked about the first high-profile assassination, that of Nizam al-Mulk, in the year 1092. But let's imagine what this event meant for its time. Nizam al-Mulk was not an ordinary official or even just an influential nobleman. This man effectively ruled the vast Seljuk Empire, which stretched from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean. Imagine this man, gray-bearded, wise, surrounded by honor and power. He not only governed the state, but also patronized the sciences and arts. His madrasas, Islamic schools, were centers of learning throughout the East. Poets dedicated qasidas to him, and philosophers sought his patronage. It seemed that such a man was beyond the reach of mere mortals. And then, one ordinary day, as the great vizier was riding in his litter on the road near Nahavand, a man in the worn clothes of a Sufi approached him. Mendicant mystics often begged for alms from noblemen, and no one suspected anything amiss. The guards were not even on alert. What harm could an old dervish do? But instead of a hand outstretched for alms, the stranger drew a dagger hidden in the folds of his clothing. One precise strike, and the powerful vizier, who held the strings of governance of half the Islamic world in his hands, was transformed into an ordinary mortal, bleeding to death on a dusty road. What struck all the witnesses to this scene? The killer did not even try to escape. He stood calmly next to the body of his victim, holding the bloodied dagger in his hand, and awaited his inevitable execution. There was neither fear nor regret, nor even triumph on his face, only a strange serenity, as if he had finally fulfilled his life's work. The guards tore him to pieces, but it was too late. The news of the assassination spread throughout the Islamic world faster than the swiftest messengers. And everywhere, people were asking the same question: who could be behind this audacious crime? The answer came soon. From the impregnable Alamut, rumors spread that this was the work of the old man of the mountain, that he had servants ready to carry out any of his orders, even if it cost them their lives, that no one, not even the most powerful ruler, was safe from his vengeance. Fear, that became the new weapon of Hassan-i Sabbah. Fear, perhaps even more effective than his daggers. For when a ruler begins to fear every stranger, every servant, every shadow in the corner, he is already half defeated. But this was only the beginning. After the death of Nizam al-Mulk, assassinations followed one after another, and each new murder only strengthened the legend of the assassins. In the year 1094, a Fida'i infiltrated the mosque of Isfahan and killed one of the sons of the great Sultan Malik Shah right during the Friday prayer. Can you imagine this scene? a sacred place where hundreds of the faithful bowed in prayer before the Almighty, and suddenly a flash of a dagger, a scream, chaos, panic. The killer was caught on the spot, but the prince was already dying, and a whisper spread through the mosque. "It is the hand of the old man of the mountain. No one can hide from it, not even in a holy place." A year later, it was the turn of another prince of the Seljuk house. Bursuk ibn Bursuk, the ruler of Hamadan, was killed right in his own palace. How the assassin got in remains a mystery. The palace was guarded, the walls were high, the guards vigilant. But in the morning, the prince was found dead in his bed with the characteristic wound of a dagger. And in the year 1103, an event occurred that shook the entire Christian world. In distant Antioch, one of the main strongholds of the Crusaders in the east, Raymond of Antioch, one of the most prominent leaders of the Crusades, was assassinated. Raymond was a cautious and experienced man. He had been fighting Muslims for many years and knew their tactics and tricks. But how can you protect yourself from an enemy who can hide under any guise? The killer pretended to be a Christian merchant from Byzantium. He traded in Antioch for several weeks, studying the prince's habits, gaining the trust of his entourage. And when the opportunity arose, he delivered the fatal blow. News of this assassination reached Europe and terrified all the participants of the Crusades. So, Muslims can kill a Christian prince right in his own city? Is there no protection from these mysterious assassins, even behind strong walls and among loyal people? But the most audacious, perhaps, was the assassination attempt on the King of Jerusalem, Conrad of Montferrat. This man was one of the most skillful military commanders of his time, a participant in many battles, a hero whose name was known from London to Constantinople. Conrad ruled in Tyre, one of the most fortified cities in the Holy Land. The city was surrounded by powerful walls, defended by experienced knights, and the king himself never went out without a guard. It seemed that he was unreachable to any enemies, but two assassins managed to deceive even such vigilance. They disguised themselves as Christian monks and lived in Tyre itself for several months. Imagine, the king's enemies prayed in the same churches where he himself prayed, walked the same streets, perhaps even conversed with his men. They patiently studied Conrad's habits, his daily routine, choosing the most opportune moment for the strike. And they waited for their hour. In the year 1192, as the king was walking through the marketplace of Tyre, both pseudo-monks simultaneously approached him from different sides. They acted with astonishing synchronicity, as if one person in two bodies. Conrad didn't even have time to understand what was happening. The first blow was fatal, but the second assassin struck again, apparently to be sure of the result. One of the killers was immediately cut down by the king's guards, while the second managed to run to the nearest church, hoping to find refuge there. But the holy place did not save him. Enraged knights burst into the temple and killed him right at the altar. But the damage had already been done. Conrad of Montferrat, one of the most powerful rulers of the Crusader states, was dead. And throughout the Christian world, rumors spread about mysterious assassins who could take any form and infiltrate any place. News of this assassination reached King Richard the Lionheart of England himself, who was in the Holy Land at the time with his crusade. And then an amazing thing happened. Negotiations began between the King of England and the Old Man of the Mountain. Yes, you heard that right. A Christian king and a Muslim heretic became allies. Politics is a strange thing. It makes people forget about religious differences when it comes to practical interests. Richard understood. It was better to have the assassins as allies than as enemies. and the old man of the mountain saw in the English king a useful partner in the fight against common opponents, primarily against Saladin, the great Muslim commander who had recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders. There is even evidence that Richard received gifts from the assassins, including poisoned daggers as a symbol of their deadly skill. And when the king left the Holy Land, the old man of the mountain allegedly gave him a safe conduct letter that was supposed to protect him from assassination attempts. But the assassins' most ambitious attempt was the assassination of Saladin himself, the man who had managed to unite the disparate Muslim states and inflict a series of crushing defeats on the Crusaders. Saladin was not just a military commander. He was a symbol of Muslim revival, a hero who was revered from Egypt to Mesopotamia. To kill such a man would have meant dealing a blow to the Islamic world from which it would not have recovered for a long time. The first attempt was made in the year 1174. A group of assassins infiltrated Saladin's military camp, disguised as warriors from auxiliary units. They almost reached the Sultan's tent, but were discovered at the last moment. A massacre began. The assassins fought like wild beasts, understanding that their hour had come. They did not ask for mercy. They did not try to surrender. They fought to their last breath, hoping to at least wound the great Sultan. Saladin was saved by a miracle, but the lesson was learned. From then on, he did not take off his chainmail even in his sleep, surrounded himself with trusted bodyguards, and changed his sleeping quarters, telling no one in advance where he would sleep. 2 years later, the assassins made a second attempt. This time they bribed one of the Sultan's cooks. Poison was to be put into the food during one of the feasts. But the plot was uncovered at the last moment. Apparently, there was a traitor among the assassins, or one of the servants suspected something was wrong. The cook was executed with particular cruelty, and Saladin tightened security measures even more. He stopped trusting even his closest people, checking every piece of food, every sip of water. After these failures, the assassins temporarily abandoned their attempts to kill the great Sultan. But the very fact that they had come so close to him twice made a huge impression on their contemporaries. If even Saladin, the hero of Islam, the unifier of the Muslims, did not feel safe, then what could be said of other rulers? Interestingly, the assassins made no particular distinction between Muslims and Christians. They were ready to serve any side if it suited their interests or could benefit the Ismaili cause. Such flexibility allowed them to survive in a world of constant wars between various religious and political factions. They killed Sunni caliphs and Shia imams, Christian princes and Muslim sultans, crusaders and Saracens. For them, what mattered was not the religious affiliation of the victim, but their role in the great political game. Each assassination was carefully planned and thought out. In Alamut, there was a whole system for gathering information about potential victims. Assassin agents infiltrated various courts, gained the trust of nobles, and studied their habits and weaknesses. Before deciding on an assassination, the old man of the mountain weighed all the circumstances for a long time. Who would take the place of the slain? How would the political situation change? Would it not harm the interests of the Ismaili cause? Sometimes just a hint of a possible assassination was enough to make a ruler change his policy. The assassins knew not only how to kill, but also how to intimidate. They could slip a dagger into a sultan's bedroom or leave a threatening note on his table. Such calling cards were sometimes more effective than actual murders. Gradually, a network of assassin agents and supporters spread throughout the Middle East. They were everywhere, in mosques and bazaars, in palaces and caravanserais, among merchants and scholars, among warriors and poets. This network allowed the assassins to stay informed about all important events, to know the plans of their enemies, and to find weak spots in their defenses. Information flowed into Alamut in a constant stream, and from there, Orders were issued that could change the fate of kingdoms. But the assassins' most terrifying weapon was not so much their ability to kill as their readiness to die. In a world where most people valued life above all else, fanatics appeared for whom death was not a tragedy, but a reward. This changed all the rules of the game. Previously, any killer could be bribed, intimidated, or persuaded. But how do you fight a man who goes to his death as if to a celebration? Thus, over several decades, a small sect, holed up in a mountain fortress, managed to terrorize half of the then-known world. Its methods seemed supernatural, its people almost immortal, and its power limitless. Each new murder only strengthened this legend, making the assassins ever more terrifying in the eyes of their opponents. And every ruler, going to sleep, would wonder, will a messenger from the old man of the mountain come for him tonight? Fortresses of fear and secret bases. Imagine you are traveling along the mountain trails of medieval Persia. The air is thin, you're out of breath from the climb, and the wind howls in the deep gorges like the souls of fallen warriors. Somewhere high on the cliffs, almost merging with the gray stone, you can see the silhouettes of impregnable fortresses. The locals only speak of them in whispers, cross themselves, and try to avoid these places. These are the domains of the assassins, stone nests from which death can fly to any point in the known world. You know, the strength of this mysterious sect lay not only in the art of secret assassination. The assassins were true masters of creating impregnable shelters in the most inaccessible places on Earth. Their fortresses were not just military fortifications like those built by ordinary feudal lords. They were entire worlds, living by their own laws, true states within a state. After Hassan-i Sabbah settled in Alamut, he understood one simple truth. One fortress, however impregnable, was not enough for a great cause. A whole network of strongholds was needed, scattered throughout the Islamic world. And he began to methodically create this network. Alamut remained the heart of their state for a century and a half, but it was far from their only stronghold. Throughout the east, from the Persian mountains to the Syrian deserts, the assassins captured, bought, or built from scratch dozens of castles and fortresses, and each one was chosen with astonishing strategic insight. In Persia, besides the main Alamut, they had the fortresses of Lamasar, Girdku, Samiran, and many others. Each stood at a key point, at the intersection of trade routes, at the entrance to mountain passes, on top of a hard-to-reach cliff. From these stone nests, the assassins could control the movement of armies, monitor caravans, and gather information about their enemies' plans. But their Syrian network was particularly impressive. In the Jabal Ansariya Mountains, between the domains of the Crusaders and the Muslim principalities, they created a true assassin state. The main stronghold here became the castle of Masyaf, a place whose name still inspires reverent awe in all who are familiar with the history of the Middle Ages. Masyaf rose on a rocky hill, and the sight of it was breathtaking. Imagine, the fortress seemed to hover over the surrounding landscape, and it appeared that only birds could reach its walls. The ascent to it was so steep and narrow that a few men could stop an entire army. But Masyaf was not alone. Around it, like stars around a bright moon, were other fortifications. Cadmus, with its impregnable towers, Kaf, hidden in the depths of a mountain gorge, the picturesque Kawabi, the formidable Rusafa. This network of fortresses allowed the assassins to control a significant part of Syria and Lebanon. And do you know what is most surprising? The assassins obtained many of these strongholds not by force of arms, but through diplomatic skill. They knew how to negotiate, to find common ground even with enemies, to bribe the right people with gold or promises. Sometimes they simply bought castles from impoverished owners, offering sums that were hard to refuse. There was an instance where they acquired a fortress through love. A young assassin fell in love with the daughter of a castle's owner, married her, and then convinced his father-in-law to sell him the fortress. A romantic story with a practical ending, very much in the spirit of this amazing sect. Life in the assassin fortresses was strictly ordered and subject to iron discipline. Special rules operated here based on Ismaili doctrine, but adapted to the needs of a military organization. Imagine a monastery, a military academy, and a university, all together under one roof. Every morning began with a common prayer. All the inhabitants of the fortress, from the highest-ranking da'is to the common servants, gathered in the inner courtyard and addressed Allah with a request for blessings. But this was not a formal ceremony. People truly believed in what they were doing, and this faith gave them the strength for the most difficult trials. After prayer, it was time for study. The assassin fortresses housed amazing libraries that could have been the pride of any capital. They contained not only religious texts, but also the works of great ancient philosophers, treatises on mathematics and astronomy, medical manuals, and historical chronicles. The assassins understood a simple truth. Knowledge is a weapon no less formidable than the sharpest dagger. An ignorant fanatic can be brave, but an educated fanatic is a serious force. Therefore, in their fortresses, everyone had to not only pray and train, but also learn. Young men studied languages, Arabic, Persian, Turkic, and sometimes even Greek and Latin. After all, they would have to operate among people of different nationalities, and knowledge of languages was vital. They studied history and geography to better understand the political situation in various countries. Special attention was paid to the study of medicine, but not to heal people, but to kill them. The assassins were the greatest poison experts of their time, true artists of death. They studied human anatomy to know exactly where to strike with a dagger. They understood the properties of various plants and minerals to create imperceptible poisons. In the cellars of the fortresses were real laboratories where master poisoners prepared their deadly concoctions. Here one could find poisons for all occasions, from those that killed instantly to those that took effect weeks later, causing symptoms of common illnesses. There were poisons that dissolved in wine and had no taste or smell. There were poisons that were effective only upon contact with the skin. They were used to coat the handles of daggers or the saddles of horses. There were even some that did not kill immediately, but first drove the victim insane, causing them to commit mad acts. It was a true science of death, brought to perfection, and the secrets of this craft were passed down from teacher to student, from generation to generation. But the fortresses served not only as training centers for killers, they were also the economic foundation of the entire assassin movement. These people did not live by war alone. They engaged in trade, crafts, and agriculture. In the valleys around the fortresses, gardens and fields turned green. The assassins grew special varieties of grapes, from which they made the famous Persian wine. They cultivated fruit trees and grew herbs, some of which were used to make medicines and poisons. Artisans in the fortresses produced weapons, textiles, and jewelry. Their craftsmanship was highly valued far beyond the Ismaili lands. Merchants from different countries came here for goods, and this brought the sect considerable income. Particularly profitable was the fact that the assassins controlled several important trade routes. Caravans traveling from Central Asia to the ports of the Mediterranean Sea had to pass through their territories, and they had to pay for safe passage. But this was not ordinary robbery. The assassins genuinely ensured the safety of merchants on the stretches of road they controlled. Not a single bandit dared to attack a caravan under their protection. Everyone in the area knew too well what happened to those who harmed the interests of the old man of the mountain. The communication system between the fortresses was impressively well organized. The assassins had an extensive network of messengers who could deliver a message from the Persian Alamut to the Syrian Masyaf faster than the official couriers of sultans and caliphs. The messengers knew every mountain path, every water source, every safe place to spend the night. They could ride for days without rest, changing horses at secret posts scattered along the route. In case of danger, they knew where to hide and whom to turn to for help. Besides messengers, other communication methods were used. Signal fires were set up on mountain peaks, which could transmit a simple message over hundreds of kilometers in a few hours. Coded signals, understood only by the initiated, were also used. Special marks on trees, stones arranged in a particular way, patterns on fabrics. And the families of the assassins also lived in the fortresses. Yes, these stern warriors had wives and children. The sect did not demand a complete renunciation of worldly life, only absolute devotion to its ideals. Women in the assassin communities held a rather high position. They not only managed the household and raised children, but also participated in intelligence gathering, sometimes acting as liaisons between different fortresses. History has preserved the names of several female assassins, although their activities are shrouded in even greater secrecy than the exploits of their husbands. From a very early age, children were raised in the spirit of Ismaili doctrine. But it was not a gloomy upbringing of fanatics. Children were taught to read and write, introduced to poetry and music, and told beautiful legends of past heroes. It was just that all this knowledge was presented through the prism of Ismaili ideas. Many of these children, when they grew up, continued their father's work. But not all became killers. Some engaged in trade, some studied the sciences, and some became artisans. The assassins understood that for their cause to succeed, people of all different professions and talents were needed. In these stone nests, scattered across mountains and deserts, a special culture was formed. Poems were created here, glorifying the deeds of the fidais, philosophical treatises explaining Ismaili doctrine, and historical chronicles recording the deeds of the old men of the mountain. Legends were born here, which then spread throughout the world and were embellished with new details. Legends of warriors who knew no fear, of sages who could see the future, of fortresses where time flowed differently. But most importantly, a special type of person was raised in these fortresses. People for whom an idea was more important than life, duty, more important than personal happiness, loyalty, more important than personal gain. The world has rarely seen such people, and that is why the assassins made such a profound impression on their contemporaries. Each fortress was not just a military fortification, it was a small world, living by the laws of a higher justice, as the Ismailis understood it. A world where there was no room for corruption and betrayal, where everyone knew their place and honestly fulfilled their duties. Of course, this world was harsh and merciless to its enemies, but for its own, it was a home, a sanctuary, a place where one could find the meaning of life and inner peace. And when the enemies of the assassins looked at these impregnable strongholds towering on the mountain peaks, they understood. These are not ordinary people living here. Here live those who are ready to die for their beliefs. And it is very difficult to fight against such people, because fortresses can be destroyed, armies can be defeated, but how do you defeat an idea that lives in the hearts of men? The decline and fall of the sect of assassins. There are moments in history when you feel the very era changing, when the old world disappears irrevocably and something completely new, incomprehensible and frightening comes to replace it. For the assassins, such a moment was the 13th century, a time when their ancient methods collided with a force against which all the daggers and poisons of the world proved powerless. Let's imagine that world for a minute. For a century and a half, the sect of the Old Man of the Mountain had terrorized rulers from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean coast. It seemed that nothing could break their mountain strongholds. Alamut stood impregnable, as if created by nature itself for defense. Masyaf dominated the Syrian mountains. Dozens of other fortresses guarded trade routes and served as a refuge for thousands of Ismailis. But from the east, from the vast steppes of Central Asia, a force was advancing that would sweep away not only the assassins, but entire empires: the Mongols. Even today, this word makes anyone familiar with the history of the Middle Ages shudder. These nomads from the distant steppes brought to the civilized world a completely new type of warfare, a war of total annihilation, without any negotiations, compromises, or mercy. At the beginning of the 13th century, few in the Islamic world took the threat from some steppe barbarians seriously. What could nomads do against powerful sultanates, against impregnable fortresses, against a centuries-old civilization? But it soon became clear that these barbarians possessed a military machine the likes of which the world had never known. You see, the assassins were used to their opponents fearing death. Their entire tactic was based on the idea that the assassination of one Khan or general could stop an entire army, sow panic, and force the enemy to retreat. But the Mongols were completely different. Their armies were so huge and organized that the death of even an important commander could not affect the course of military operations. They had a clear system of replacement. Every commander had a deputy ready to immediately take command. And most importantly, the Mongol Khans ruled not autocratically like Muslim sultans, but through the collective leadership of the Kurultai, a popular assembly. Moreover, the Mongols fought not for power or wealth. They fought for the very survival of their people. For them, war was a natural state, and death in battle, an honorable end to life. Such people were not afraid of the assassins because they themselves were ready to die at any moment. The first clashes between the assassins and the Mongols occurred at the beginning of the 13th century, when the hordes of Genghis Khan first invaded the Islamic world. At that time, the assassins tried to use their usual tactic, to send assassins to the Mongol commanders. Several attempts were even successful, but this only angered the conquerors without stopping their advance. And then came the year 1256, the year that became the last in the history of the Persian assassins. Hulagu Khan, grandson of the great Genghis Khan and brother of the ruler of the entire Mongol Empire, received orders to conquer the entire Middle East. And unlike previous conquerors, the Mongols were not going to be content with submission and tribute. They wanted the complete destruction of all who dared to oppose them. The last Grand Master of the Persian assassins was named Rukn al-Din Qurshah. This man inherited power at the most difficult time in the entire history of the sect. The Mongol Tumans were already approaching the borders of the Ismaili domains, and there were no allies. Everyone was afraid of incurring the wrath of the invincible conquerors. Rukn al-Din was an educated and intelligent man. He understood. The assassins had no chance in an open battle with the Mongols. Their mountain fortresses were, of course, difficult to access, but the Mongols had already proven more than once that they knew how to take the most impregnable strongholds. Perhaps it would be possible to negotiate? After all, the assassins had always been famous for their art of diplomacy. When the Mongol army, 150,000 horsemen clad in armor, approached the Alamut Valley, the last old man of the mountain made a desperate decision. He sent his representatives to Hulagu with a proposal for negotiations. Qurshah was ready for any concessions. He agreed to recognize the supreme authority of the Mongol Khan, to pay tribute, and even to hand over hostages from his own family. In return, he asked for only one thing: to spare the lives of his people and to allow the Ismaili communities to exist under a Mongol protectorate. Hulagu listened to these proposals and even agreed to negotiate, but his terms were harsh. All assassin fortresses must be surrendered without a fight, all weapons laid at the feet of the victors, all treasures handed over to the Mongol treasury. And most importantly, all assassins had to come out of their shelters and surrender to the mercy of the conquerors. Rukn al-Din understood that this meant death for most of his people. But what was there to do? He hoped that the Mongols, having received what they wanted, would show mercy. A naive man. He did not understand who he was dealing with. In November of the year 1256, the gates of Alamut opened, and Mongol warriors entered the fortress that had seemed impregnable for a century and a half. What happened next was a tragedy not only for the assassins, but for all of humanity. The Mongols were not accustomed to keeping promises made to infidels. After the capitulation of Alamut, the methodical destruction of everything associated with the assassins began. The fortresses were destroyed stone by stone. The Mongols wanted to wipe even the memory of this place from the face of the earth. The walls that seemed eternal were turned into piles of rubble. The towers from which the Fidais had looked out at the world collapsed with a roar, the echo of which resounded through the mountain valleys. The population of the fortresses was partly expelled, partly simply exterminated. The Mongols made no distinction between warriors and civilians, between men and women, between adults and children. But the greatest tragedy was the fate of the library of Alamut, one of the greatest libraries of the medieval world. Imagine, for centuries, the rarest manuscripts in dozens of languages, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Sanskrit, Syriac, had been collected here. The works of great ancient philosophers, which could be found nowhere else, were stored here. There were mathematical treatises that were centuries ahead of their time, astronomical observations, medical manuals, historical chronicles, and poetic works. It was a treasury of human thought, collected by the efforts of many generations of scholars and scribes. And the Mongols simply burned all this wealth. They saw in books only a source of harmful ideas that could inspire new resistance. For them, manuscripts were not cultural monuments, but a dangerous weapon of the enemy. The flames consumed the works of centuries, and the smoke from the burning books hung over the ruins of Alamut for several days, like the funeral pyre of an entire civilization. Eyewitnesses said that the ashes of the burned manuscripts covered the surrounding valleys in a thick layer, like snow after a long winter storm. Modern historians consider the destruction of the Alamut Library one of the greatest cultural catastrophes in human history. We will never know what discoveries and ideas perished in that fire, what secrets of antiquity were lost forever. Rukn al-Din Qurshah himself was initially left alive. Hulagu even took him with him on the campaign to Baghdad, apparently hoping to use him as a puppet to control the remaining supporters of the assassins. The last old man of the mountain rode in the victor's baggage train, watching the world to which he had dedicated his life collapse. But soon he became a burden to the conquerors. The Mongols needed not the loyalty of the conquered peoples, but their complete submission. Puppet rulers could also become centers of resistance, so they had to be eliminated. By order of Hulagu, the last Persian old man of the mountain was killed somewhere on the road between Hamadan and Baghdad. Thus ended, ingloriously, the century-and-a-half history of the assassins in Persia. The man who could, with a single word, send death to any ruler of the East, himself died in the roadside dust, like a common captive. But the Persian assassins were not the only branch of the sect. In Syria, their brethren were still continuing the fight. True, their position was also becoming increasingly precarious, but for other reasons. The Syrian assassins faced not a Mongol invasion, but internal problems. By the end of the 13th century, the era of the Crusades was coming to an end. The Christian states in the east were weakening, and the new masters of the region, the Egyptian Mamluks, were pursuing a policy of strict centralization. The Mamluks were former slave warriors who had seized power in Egypt and created one of the most effective military states of the Middle Ages. They were not going to tolerate any autonomous entities on their borders, especially ones as dangerous as the Ismaili fortresses. In the year 1273, Sultan Baybars, the same one who had expelled the Crusaders from most of their strongholds, turned his attention to the Syrian assassins. Unlike the Mongols, he did not seek the complete extermination of the sect, but the political independence of the assassins was completely unacceptable to him. The Mamluk army was well organized and experienced in siege warfare. Sultan Baybars systematically captured the fortresses of the Syrian assassins one after another. Masyaf fell after a short siege, followed by Kaf, Kadmus, and other strongholds. The last Syrian Da'i, the leader of the local assassins, understood the futility of resistance. He agreed to capitulate, but managed to negotiate rather lenient terms for his people. The assassins were not annihilated. They were simply deprived of their political independence and incorporated into the Mamluk army as ordinary soldiers. Many former Fidais began to serve the Egyptian sultans, using their unique skills no longer for the Ismaili cause, but to strengthen the Mamluk state. The irony of fate. The people who had once terrorized all the rulers of the East themselves became the servants of one such ruler. Thus ended the era of the assassins as an independent political force. Their fortresses were destroyed or passed into other hands. Their libraries were burned or plundered. Their leaders perished or submitted to new masters. But why did this powerful organization, which had held half the world in fear for a century and a half, fall so easily and quickly? What was the reason for their defeat? First, the assassins fell victim to the changing nature of warfare itself. Their methods were effective in a world of personalized power, where the assassination of one man could change the political situation. But against the mass armies of the Mongols or the centralized state of the Mamluks, these methods proved ineffective. Second, the assassins failed to adapt to the new conditions. They relied for too long on their traditional advantages, the impregnability of their fortresses, the skill of their killers, the fear of their opponents. But the world changed, and they remained faithful to old methods. Third, the assassins lacked mass popular support. Their ideas were too elitist, their organization too secretive. When trouble came, they had nowhere to look for help. Finally, the assassins became victims of their own success. Their reputation was so terrible that no one dared to come to their defense. Everyone preferred to wait until the Mongols or Mamluks solved the assassin problem for them. The fall of the sect was swift and final. Within a few decades, an organization that had seemed eternal and invulnerable disappeared. The walls of the fortresses crumbled, the fear of the old man of the mountain dissipated, and the legends of the invincible Fidais fell silent. And now, let's talk about how this medieval sect, which disappeared 7 centuries ago, continues to influence our modern world. Because the death of the last Fidais did not at all mean the disappearance of their ideas, methods, and legacy. On the contrary, in some sense, the assassins proved to be more resilient than many empires and dynasties. You know, there is an amazing paradox in history. Organizations that seemed all-powerful during their lifetime disappear without a trace, and those that looked fragile and doomed leave a mark for centuries. The assassins are a prime example of this paradox. The descendants of those very assassins live among us today. The Ismaili community, numbering about 15 million people worldwide, still exists and thrives. They are led by the Aga Khan, a direct descendant of the imams whom the medieval fidais served. Imagine an unbroken chain of spiritual succession stretching nearly 1,000 years extends from Hassan-i Sabbah to the current Aga Khan. But what a striking change! Modern Ismailis are peaceful people known for their charity and love of peace. The Aga Khan Foundation is one of the largest charitable organizations in the world. They build hospitals in Afghanistan and schools in Africa, universities in Central Asia, and cultural centers in Europe. It is hard to believe that these good people, helping the poor and the sick, are the descendants of those who terrorized the medieval world. But it is a wonderful example of how a religious tradition can evolve, how ideas can change while retaining their deep essence. However, the influence of the assassins extends far beyond the Ismaili community. The very word assassin has long become international, entering all European languages as a synonym for a professional killer. In English, assassin; in French, assassin; in German, attentator. This shows what a deep impression the medieval assassins made on the Western consciousness. When European crusaders returned home from the Holy Land, they brought with them not only trophies and relics, but also stories of mysterious assassins from the East. These stories were passed from mouth to mouth, embellished with new details, and turned into legends. And gradually, the word assassin became a common noun. The methods of the medieval assassins had a huge impact on the development of what we today call political terrorism. The idea of targeted elimination of key figures as a way to change the political situation became a classic for many extremist organizations in subsequent centuries. The Russian Narodovoltsi of the 19th century, who assassinated Emperor Alexander II, largely repeated the tactics of the assassins. They too were a small group of fanatics ready to sacrifice their lives for an idea. They too carefully planned their operations, studied the habits of their victims, and used various covers. The Serbian terrorists who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand and started the First World War can also be called heirs of the assassins. Like their medieval predecessors, they believed that one successful assassination could change the course of history. And in a sense, they were right. Their shots in Sarajevo did indeed change the world. The principle of readiness for self-sacrifice for an idea became particularly important. The fidais, who calmly accepted death after completing their mission, unfortunately became the prototype for modern suicide terrorists. This sad phenomenon, which has become one of the main threats of our time, has its roots precisely in the philosophy of the medieval assassins. The Japanese kamikaze of the Second World War, the Palestinian shaheeds, the Islamic suicide terrorists, all of them, to one degree or another, repeat the behavioral model first developed in the fortresses of Alamut and Masyaf. The readiness to die for an idea, the transformation of one's own death into a weapon against the enemy, these principles were born with the assassins. In literature and cinema, the assassins have long become a symbol of the mysterious East, deadly skill, and fanatical devotion. From the classic novel by the Slovenian writer Vladimir Bartol, Alamut, to modern Hollywood action movies and computer games, the image of the assassin has firmly entered mass culture. Interestingly, in popular culture, assassins are often romanticized and idealized. They are portrayed as noble warriors fighting against tyranny and injustice. Of course, such an interpretation is far from historical reality, but it shows the amazing resilience of the myths about this mysterious sect. The computer game Assassin's Creed, which has become one of the most popular in the world, presents the assassins as defenders of freedom, opposing the secret order of the Templars who strive for world domination. Millions of players around the world know about the medieval assassins precisely from this game, albeit in a highly romanticized form. Modern intelligence services have also borrowed a lot from the medieval assassins. The methods of covert surveillance, infiltration of agents into enemy organizations, psychological influence on a target audience, all this existed in embryonic form in the fortresses of the Old Man of the Mountain. The CIA, Mossad, MI6, SVR, all modern intelligence agencies use techniques that were first developed by the assassins almost 1,000 years ago, creating legends for agents, long-term infiltration into the enemy's camp, using various covers. All this came to us from the Middle Ages. Even the famous poisoned umbrellas of the Cold War are a direct legacy of the assassins' methods. After all, it was the assassins who first began to use exotic poisons to eliminate political opponents. It was they who perfected the art of stealthy killing. The history of the assassins clearly shows how a small but well-organized group can influence big politics. In the Middle Ages, when power was concentrated in the hands of individual rulers, the elimination of one person could indeed radically change the course of events. In our modern world, where power is more institutionalized and distributed among various bodies, such a tactic is less effective. The assassination of even a very important politician rarely leads to radical changes. His place is quickly taken by a successor, and the system continues to function. But the tactics of the assassins have not completely disappeared. They have evolved, adapted to new conditions. Modern terrorists understand that one murder will not solve the problem, so they have switched to mass terrorist attacks, the goal of which is not so much to eliminate a specific person as to sow fear among the population and destabilize society. The assassins also left a noticeable mark on the development of diplomacy. Their art of negotiation, their ability to maneuver between warring parties, their use of fear and respect as diplomatic tools, all this has entered the arsenal of modern politics. The principle of soft power, which is actively used by many states today, largely goes back to the methods of the assassins. They understood that sometimes a threat can be more effective than real action, that a reputation is worth more than an army, that the fear of opponents is also a form of power. Modern diplomacy widely uses techniques of psychological pressure that were first developed in the mountains of Persia and Syria, creating the right image in the eyes of the opponent, manipulating their fears and hopes, using uncertainty as a tool of influence. All this came to us from the medieval masters of secret warfare. But perhaps the most important legacy of the assassins is a reminder of how dangerous fanaticism and blind devotion to any idea, no matter how noble it may seem, can be. The history of this sect is a lesson that humanity, unfortunately, has not yet fully learned. The assassins sincerely believed that they were fighting for justice, that their cause was holy, that the end justifies any means. This logic is familiar to us today. It is used by terrorists of all stripes, justifying their crimes with high ideals. History shows, when people begin to consider themselves bearers of absolute truth, when they stop doubting the correctness of their actions, when they are ready to kill and die for abstract ideas, the world becomes a dangerous place. The assassins were convinced that they knew how to make the world a better place. They were willing to sacrifice lives, their own and others, for this bright future. But in the end, they brought the world only fear and death. Their fortresses turned into ruins, their ideas into a justification for new crimes, their legacy into a curse for subsequent generations. At the same time, it cannot be denied, the assassins were people of their time, a product of that harsh and cruel era. In a world where justice often triumphed only on the edge of a sword, where the weak became victims of the strong, where the powerful committed arbitrary acts, in such a world, the appearance of the assassins was almost inevitable. They became a response to injustice, albeit a wrong one. They tried to protect their ideals, albeit with inappropriate means. They wanted to change the world for the better, even if their ideas of what was better were debatable. Today, when we look at the ruins of their fortresses, when we read about their deeds in old chronicles, we can judge them more objectively. We see not only the terror they sowed, but also the desperation that pushed them to such actions. We understand not only the cruelty of their methods, but also the sincerity of their faith. The fortresses of the assassins have long since turned into piles of stones. Their libraries have burned in the fires of wars, and the last fidei passed into oblivion many centuries ago. But the memory of them lives on, in legends and tales passed down from generation to generation, in the books of historians and the novels of writers, in the films of directors and the games of programmers. This memory also lives on in the methods of modern intelligence services, in the tactics of terrorist organizations, and in the techniques of political technologists. Sometimes openly, sometimes hidden, but everywhere one can find echoes of the ideas that were born in the mountain fortresses of the medieval East. And as long as injustice and fanaticism exist in the world, as long as there are people willing to kill for an idea, as long as power and religion can be used to justify crimes, the story of the assassins will remain relevant. Not as a guide to action, God forbid, but as a warning, as a reminder of where blind faith in one's own righteousness can lead a person, as a lesson from history that each generation must learn anew. Such is the fate of this amazing and terrifying sect, to become part of our common memory, our common experience, our common understanding of what a person is capable of in the name of faith. And perhaps, by studying their history, by reflecting on their fate, we will be able to avoid repeating their mistakes. Because the most important lesson of the assassins is not how to effectively kill enemies, but how dangerous it is to consider oneself a judge over the life and death of other people. No matter how noble our goals may be, no matter how holy our ideals may seem to us, we do not have the right to take from others what nature or God has given them. This is the main testament that the children of Alamut have left us.